So more and more people are joining us. Thank you. So welcome to today's webinar on trauma through the ACE lens, developing trauma-informed classrooms. This webinar is co-sponsored. This webinar is presented by the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, or MHTTC, housed at Rutgers School of Health Professions, Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation. My name is Kathy Rivera, and I'm the project coordinator of this center, and will be facilitating the webinar today. The MHTTC is funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, to enhance the capacity of the behavioral health and other related workforces to deliver evidence-based and empirically supported practices to individuals with mental illnesses. Please visit the MHTTC Network website for additional information at mhttcnetwork.org. And if you're interested in staying up to date with the events and products the Northeast and Caribbean MHTTC is providing, please sign up to receive our email communications. You can sign up at the bit.ly link provided on the screen. Next slide, please. Following this webinar, you'll be asked to complete a brief survey. We value this feedback and use it to improve our services and inform future activities. The surveys are also important because our continued funding is linked to the completion of these surveys. So we thank you in advance for your feedback. Next slide. We also want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our website along with the PowerPoint slides in the next couple of days. We encourage you to interact with our presenter during the webinar by using the chat feature. Please post any comments or questions you have in the chat, and I will collect your questions as we go and ask of them to the presenter during the Q&A time towards the end of the presentation. During the webinar, our presenter may pose questions to you, so please use the chat feature to answer those questions. This presentation was prepared for the MHTTC network under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Illness Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. So all material appearing in this presentation, except that directly from copyrighted sources, is in the public domain and may be reproduced or copied without permission from SAMHSA or the authors. Citation of the source is appreciated. This presentation will be recorded and posted on our website. At the time of this presentation, Eleanor McCants-Katz is serving as SAMHSA Assistant Secretary. The opinions expressed herein are the views of the presenters and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services, or SAMHSA. No official support or endorsement or DHHS SAMHSA for the opinions described in this presentation is intended or should be inferred. Now let's begin our webinar. We have PJ Wenger with us today. PJ has 29 years of experience working in the field of mental health. She has spent considerable time in a variety of settings developing her counseling experience. These settings include psychiatric emergency, inpatient treatment with both adults and children, in-home counseling for mental health issues, residential treatment, schools, and private practice. In the school setting, PJ has worked at the elementary school level, the middle school level, and the high school level. In addition to this experience, PJ has been a trauma responder at the local, state, and national level. She has been a responder to large events like 9/11, Hurricane Sandy, as well as traumatic events that affect schools such as suicide, traumatic deaths of staff and students, and homicides. PJ is licensed by the New Jersey State Board of Family and Health Practitioners and is a certified member of the National Board of Certified Counselors. She has a master's in counseling and an EDS in marriage and family therapy. So I'll turn it over to PJ and welcome all. Thank you, PJ.
Good morning, everybody. I should say good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Typically, I'm on camera, but I'm going to be off camera today so that you can just really focus on the information that I'm going to be giving you. We have a lot of information that I'm going to be going through, and we'll have Q&A at the end, but please post your questions as we go. So our objectives today is to really define trauma and the various types of trauma. We're going to explore the adverse childhood experiences, which is the ACE, and our personal ACE score. We're going to, hopefully, by the end of this time, understand how trauma manifests in our lives and the lives of our students and understand some of the signs and symptoms. We're going to be able to define and understand what a trauma-informed approach looks like. And we're going to learn how to create a trauma-informed classroom and address student behaviors to improve mental health. So we start by defining trauma. And trauma is events and circumstances which may include the actual extreme threat or physical or psychological harm. So we typically think of natural disasters, violence. It can be severe life-threatening, that is lasting adverse effects that, you know, really threatens a child. And it has lasting effects on our individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, and emotional well-being. There are multiple definitions of trauma, and I'm going to show you a couple more. This is from the APA, the first one, an emotional response to a terrible event. And of course, they list some of the terrible events. An extremely upsetting, or at least temporarily overwhelming event that overwhelms our ability to really reach inside and respond to that event, and produces lasting psychological symptoms. And exposure to an experience or event or a series of events that are frightening or threatening and have lasting effects, which are overwhelming and challenge one's ability to cope. And this is what we're really looking at in terms of the COVID, because how each person really looks at it is determining how they're experiencing it and whether it is traumatic to them. So individuals tend to assign meaning to an event, and this is what is disrupted physically and psychologically by the event, which will contribute to whether or not it is experienced as traumatic. So I just want us to look at some trauma facts. The long-lasting adverse effects of trauma may occur immediately or may have a delayed onset. So we're really looking at short and long-term effects. And we just look at some of these figures. If we think about it, 2/3 of children report at least one traumatic event by age 16, which means most of the children that you're dealing with in school have already experienced some kind of traumatic event. 1 in 4 high school students have been in a physical fight. That does not necessarily mean in school. It could be anywhere. 1 in 5 high school students was bullied, and we certainly have covered the topic of bullying and how much it affects our children. What we know is that there's a lot of cyberbullying going on at the moment in the social media, and that is one in 6 children who experience that. You know, the national average of child abuse and neglect victims in 2013 was 679,000. That is a lot of children, and that is 2013 statistic, which means that it's only gone up. 19% of injured and 12% of physically ill youth have PTSD. 54% of U.S. families have been affected by a disaster. Most recent disasters, of course, is the COVID, which has affected a lot of families in terms of loved ones. 70% of U.S. adults have experienced at least one traumatic event. And I want you to keep that figure in your head, because we're going to come back to that when we look at our ACEs later on. And each year, the number of youth requiring hospital treatment for physical assault could fill every seat in 9 football stadiums. So if we think about 9 football stadiums with every seat filled with children, that's how many physical assault injuries require hospital treatment each year. So that's a lot of children. And what we're knowing about our situation right now is that we're really not seeing our children every day. So things are happening that we may not know about. So there are 4 types of trauma. We're going to talk about 3 of those today. Acute trauma is a single traumatic event of a sudden loss, physical or sexual assault. So again, the key word there is a single traumatic event. Chronic trauma is multiple and varied events, like domestic violence, which is ongoing and keeps happening, serious car accident where there's multiple surgeries afterwards, or a victim of community violence. So sometimes when I have been in some of the urban cities doing some trainings with our young people on trauma, I have children who will tell me that gunshots are a natural part of their environment and they hear them all the time. And they don't even realize that that is a traumatic event for them, because they've become so numb to that event. Complex trauma is multiple interpersonal traumatic events from a very young age, emotional or physical abuse or constant neglect. Secondary trauma is the one we are not going to really look at today, because secondary trauma happens to those of us who are providers who work with the children with traumatic with trauma every day, and we hear their stories over and over again, and sometimes the providers can experience secondary trauma. And although that's a really important area, we're not going to address that today. We're really going to focus on the children. So the 3 E's of trauma are really how somebody experiences the event, how somebody experiences it, and the effect of that event. So we know that different people experience events differently. So for instance, there was a convenience store robbery. There were 2 men, customers in the store at the time of the robbery. The gentleman came in, he held up a gun, he held up the man behind the counter and asked for money. The counter man gave the money to him. The perpetrator subsequently knocked the counter man out and fled the scene. When the police arrived, the 2 customers who were there reacted very differently. The one customer was on his phone, FaceTiming everybody, sending social media. You can't believe what just happened. I was at the convenience store and it got robbed and everybody's okay, but how wild that I was in this event. The second individual, who was a customer in the store, was crouched in the corner in a fetal position, unable to speak or talk. So that just shows you how 2 people can experience an event completely different. And again, some of that experience of the event goes back to our childhood and our traumatic events that have happened to us in our lives. So we really want to look at our ACE score. And our ACE scores are adverse childhood experiences. And this is not a test that I want you to think about in terms of pass-fail. It's really just an awareness tool. It gives us an awareness of what kind of adverse childhood experiences that we have had. And it's really important to know our own when we are working with children who have had their own adverse childhood experiences. And this ACE study was one of the largest investigations of childhood abuse, neglect, and household challenges, and how those events affected the individual's later life in terms of health and well-being and relationships and things like that. And I'm going to show you a little bit of that later. So I'm going to warn you before we begin that some of these questions may be very difficult to think about. And again, I'm not asking you to report this to your coworkers or your boss. This is for an individual awareness for you so that you are aware of what your ACE score is. So we're just going to go through a series of 10 questions, and you're just going to record your yes responses. So it's very easy. I'm going to read the questions and give you a moment to jot down your responses, and we're going to talk about the scores at the end. So the first question is, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you? Or act in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically hurt? Answering yes or no. Number 2, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? A yes/no response. Question 3, did an adult person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you, or have you touch their body in a sexual way, or attempt or actually have oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse with you? Yes or no. Number 4, did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special? Or your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? Yes or no. Number 5, did you often or very often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, and had no one to protect you? Or your parents were too drunk or high to take care of you or take you to the doctor if you needed it? Yes or no. Number 6, were your parents ever separated or divorced? Number 7, was your mother or stepmother often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her? Or sometimes, often, or very often kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard? Or ever repeatedly hit at least a few times or threatened with a gun or knife? Yes or no. Number 8, did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic or who used street drugs? Yes or no. Number 9, was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? Yes or no. And for this question, I really want you to think about those family members who may or may not have been diagnosed and treated. Number 10, did a household member go to prison? So now I just want you to add up your yes answers, and that is your ACE score. So our ACE score is the amount of adverse childhood experiences that we've had. And what does that mean? So we typically try to encourage anyone who has an ACE score of 4 or more to be in some kind of counseling. 1 to 4 tells you that you've had an adverse childhood experience that could affect your life. And we're going to look at how our adverse childhood experiences affect our life later on. So again, remember that statistic, 70% of people, of adults, have experienced one traumatic event, which means that they would have an ACE score of 1. But this is just some statistics on how many of these things happen in people's lives. So if you look at 27% of people had some kind of substance abuse in their life, parental divorce or separation, mental illness, again, diagnosed or not diagnosed. We see the abuse statistics, psychological, 11%, physical, 28%, sexual, 21%. And sometimes abuse statistics are a little skewed because there's a lot of abuse that goes unreported. And then there's neglect, so 15% or 10%. So again, if you've had a high ACE score, if your ACE score was in that mid-range, I don't want you to panic or think there's something wrong with you. It's just we really need to be watching how those events affect how we function as adults. So here's what we know about our ACE scores. As our number of adverse childhood experiences increases, so does our risk of having social, emotional, or cognitive impairment. We're going to look at that a little bit later. It does increase our risk of adapting non-healthy, risky behaviors like smoking, drinking, using drugs, gambling, sex addiction. These things will then again lead to disease, disability, and social problems. And then eventually what we know with high ACE scores is that people who have a high ACE score experience early death. Now, that does not mean to say that these things cannot be corrected. And that's why, we really want to begin to look at people and our students and those around us through the lens of trauma sensitive. So again, the effects of our childhood experiences, all of these things will lead up to an early death if we don't have some kind of interventions or change in how we approach people or how we are impacted or how these affect our lives. So I use this picture so that people understand that trauma affects every part of our body. And I can't tell you how often I have been on a trauma response where people are not even aware sometimes that they're being affected by the trauma that is happening around them. So that was one of the things that happened to a lot of the first responders on 9/11. It also happened at Hurricane Sandy when there was so much demand for first responders to really show up and be present and do really hard work. We're watching that also now as we watch first responders in the climate of COVID, our ICU nurses and our doctors, and how this degree of death and the amount of death is really affecting them as a traumatic event. So trauma affects us emotionally, it affects us behaviorally, cognitively, physically, interpersonal difficulties in our relationships, and in how we see the world. So we're going to look at each of these individually. So trauma really affects the brain. There is actual physical brain changes. So the physical structure of the brain is dynamic. It is never static. It is never staying in one place. Brain structure interacts with brain functioning. So we have to remember that when children are experiencing trauma and when they are functioning in front of us, and we're going to look at some of those things, we have to understand that their brain is different. And I'm going to show you some pictures of some brains. They actually have a smaller brain size, which again, because brain structure interacts with brain function, results in a lower IQ. They have a smaller corpus callosi, which is the part of the brain that connects the right and left hemisphere. They have what we call cortical atrophy, which is typically seen in Alzheimer's disease, in the brains of patients with Alzheimer's disease, but it can be a result of physical abuse, which results in developmental delays in memory. Think of somebody who has Alzheimer's and they can't remember things, or they can't follow a sequence, or they can't organize themselves. When children have this same type of traumatic injury, they are functioning like those people who have Alzheimer's that we see. So, again, things that are affected: observation, their feeling, their reflexes, their memory, some of the things that we need every day for school. So I just want to go through how trauma really works in, affecting the brain. So the normal person, there's an event that happens, which we call the stimulus. Our sensory translator, which is our hypothalamus, that part of our brain, absorbs the sensory information, and then in a typical non-traumatized brain, it goes to our cortex, which uses information from past events, knowledge, our experiences, and makes decisions about how we're going to respond to that stimulus. And then we have, an emotional computer, our amygdala, which is kind of our alarm system, and that determines our response. So if in our cortex, we decide that whatever event is not traumatizing to me and I can handle it, and here's how I'm going to handle it based on the information I have and the experiences and the learning, then my alarm doesn't necessarily go off, but I have a response. Again, a slower route is when my sensory translator, the hypothalamus, absorbs the sensory information from the stimulus, from the event. It goes into my hippocampus, where I store my most recent memories, and then I'm a little slower to respond and into my emotional computer, and whether I'm going to have an alarm system go off or not, and what response I'm going to have. But for children who are operating from a very traumatized place, what happens is the stimulus or the event is in front of them, their sensory translator goes into hyperdrive, they respond immediately without ever using their cortex or hippocampus to really figure out how to respond. And for them, the alarms are going off and their response is immediate. So for instance, sometimes a good example is if I walk up to a student who's having difficulty or not paying attention or not doing what they're supposed to do, and I put my hand on their shoulder to say, hey, what's the matter? And they turn around and immediately go, don't touch me. That means that my touching them went right to their sensory translator, which immediately set off the alarm system for them to be in a panic and think that something was wrong. So that's just to show you how the information gets transferred into our brains when we are traumatized. So again, just another visual representation of how fast that response may be when a traumatized brain activates their alarm system instead of using their hippocampus or their cortex. So here's a picture from Dr. Perry, who has done a lot of research on how trauma affects the brain. And we can see these are two brains side by side. So the one on the left is a typical brain of a child who has not experienced any trauma. And the one on the right is from a Romanian orphan who suffered sensory deprivation. And you can see that the right brain is physically smaller and has enlarged ventricles. And it actually has holes in the center of the brain, shrunken cortex. So we can visually see how these two brains are different. So you may have in your classroom children who are sitting there with a brain that looks similar to the one on the right. And so again, their functioning is not going to be necessarily what we expect. You know, another picture of that, you can see the physical difference in the size of the brains. And if you want to look up Dr. Bruce Perry, he does phenomenal work on looking at brain scans and children who have been victims of trauma. So we're going to look at how the trauma affects us in all domains that we identified before. And the first one we're going to look at is affective. So children may experience fear. And again, it may be frightening, intrusive memories during the day. They may be sitting in your classroom and having thoughts going through their head, or it may be nightmares at night. And they will experience the same reactions when exposed to reminders of the traumatic event. So for instance, if a child was in a car accident and they came out unscathed, there was no problems, but the event was very traumatic, maybe their mom got injured or a sibling got injured, when they pass the scene of the accident, it is going to feel to them like they are re-experiencing that accident all over again. They may experience sadness and depression. We can see that in some of our students. And again, it may arise in response to an abrupt loss of trust in other people and the world. They may have suicidal ideations because they feel like nobody else feels like they do. We may see anger, and anger may take the form of non-compliant behaviors, rages, tantrums. Sometimes they're physically aggressive towards their peers, or they break things. Again, this is not making excuses for all children's behavior. It is really looking at things differently. And we'll distinguish how we do that differently a little bit later on after we look at how this affects us. Certainly anxiety, we see that in children because they're being triggered, their alarm system is going off, and they are wanting to run or flee or get away from things. Severe affective dysregulation, we see that. They're unable to regulate their emotions. And then all of this sort of results in them having a negative self-image. They may think there's something wrong with them, or that the event was their fault if they had done something different. I often hear children say, if I had done my homework, my father wouldn't have been mad, he wouldn't have hit my mother. Again, nothing to do with the child, but that's the interpretation. Behavioral trauma symptoms. So we see this in the classroom a lot of times, and sometimes we miss it. Avoidance. They want to avoid thoughts or people or places or situations that trigger a recollection of their traumatic experience. So for instance, if there was a child at school and he was molested in the shower, he stopped showering at school. And eventually he may stop showering altogether because the shower triggers the memory of that abuse and he can no longer handle it. It's overwhelming to him. But all we see is that the child's not showering, And again, we have to look beyond some of the symptoms to find out what's really going on underneath. Modeling. Children who grow up in an abusive home observe and learn maladaptive behaviors and coping strategies. So, a child who grows up in a home with domestic violence learns that hitting and abuse is a way of interacting with people. They don't know that there's anything different. Self-injury. Self-injury is a child's attempt to gain feeling. Sometimes it can be attention seeking, but mostly it's a reaction to the unbearable pain they feel and they can't describe. So they're trying to get some kind of a release. Traumatic bonding. Call this the Stockholm syndrome. It's when, you see bruises on a child and you might call Children Protective Services and that something's going on just by the child's behavior in your class, but the child defends the abusive parent. We see that a lot. Overfunctioning or parentification. These are the children that look really well in school and they're very helpful and they love to be in charge and be leaders, and sometimes they're overfunctioning. And so again, we have to really look behind the symptoms and see what's there. The tantrums and rages, we've already talked about, and sometimes those can come from out of nowhere. I've heard educators say to me, I don't know what happened. Suddenly they exploded. And again, that is that inability to regulate the emotions. That's being triggered by something in the environment that brought me back to that alarm system in my head. These are where we see the behavioral symptoms. Cognitive symptoms. Sometimes children have inaccurate cognitions. And when I say inaccurate, I mean because they couldn't trust maybe a mom or a dad because they were abusive or neglectful, they then believe that no one is trustworthy. And so they operate in the world that they can't trust anybody. That's a little inaccurate, but again, a child's perception. Or they have irrational cognitions. Again, blaming myself. If I had done my homework, Dad wouldn't have been mad and he wouldn't have hit my mom. if I, he wouldn't have sexually abused me if I had not worn a dress. So do you see how sometimes they take the traumatic event and they begin to have these distorted cognitions about how they look at it? Loss of faith is one of the really hard ones for children, because little children, the concept of God is already abstract, but if they grow up in a home where religion is very important and then these bad things happen, they do lose faith in God, or they don't believe that he exists, or they believe that there is no hope for them, there's no future. So for instance, a child whose brother dies in a violent crime may lose faith that he will ever make it to adulthood. And he may just start taking, risks because he sees no future for himself. So again, looking at what the behavior is what is going on underneath the symptoms. And relationships are really hard when you can't trust somebody else or you have low self-esteem. And, I ask adults, think of your relationships with your partners, or think of a friend, who maybe their partner kept a secret or there was an infidelity. Those relationships are really hard to recover when you can't trust somebody. So think of a child who doesn't trust adults in their lives. Interpersonal trauma. This is a lot of children who have been very traumatized will withdraw from their peers because for a couple reasons. One, they can't share their shameful experiences with other children because other children may not understand, or they will think that peers will look at them differently or judge them differently if they know what's really going on in their lives. So I don't tell anybody that my father comes home drunk and hits me because nobody else talks about a father drinking, or I might be really ashamed, or they might think there's something wrong with my family. A child who is sexually abused at night avoids things that happen at the night. So there was a case of a child. She had very good friend. They used to have sleepovers all the time. And then there was an event where she was sexually abused, and she stopped avoiding things that happened at night. So she stopped sleeping over at her friend's house. Her friend kept asking her, please come sleep over, come sleep over. She kept refusing. Eventually the friend stopped inviting her, and the friend interpreted it as, she doesn't want to be my friends anymore. So in addition to the loss of faith and trust and everything else around the sexual abuse, then she lost her friend, but she couldn't explain to her friend what was going on. So again, another loss in this child's life that again changes their perception of the world. They have difficulty enjoying activities. They have difficulty establishing relationships, again, because they don't want to tell their secrets, or they don't think anybody's going to love them, or they don't think that they're good enough. And sometimes they begin to affiliate with children who are high risk. So they begin to maybe run with gangs, or maybe get involved in drug culture because there's no judgments there, and they find relief there, and they don't have to talk about their situation there. Or they find other kids who are experiencing the same thing there, and they think that's a place where they're at home. The other thing is they might have relationships with younger children because it's easier to be in a relationship with the younger children where they don't ask so many questions, and it's just all about simple play. The worst part about trauma is it changes our perception of ourself and the world. So again, these children do not feel like they belong anywhere. They look at their peers and they don't fit in with them. So again, they don't know where they belong. They don't feel like they belong anywhere. They lose hope. They lose hope that there's a future. They lose hope that there's anything good for them in the world. Opportunity, they see no future for opportunity. They really look at themselves as good or bad, and mostly they look at themselves as bad. Scary, the world is a scary place and all the people in it are scary, and I can't count on anything or anybody. Everything is unpredictable, and that no one can help. And these are the places where we're really going to focus when we talk about trauma-informed care, because we have to change these perceptions of our children's self and the world. So I put this slide up there. I was sitting in a conference with Dr. Ginsberg, who does a lot on trauma and resilience in children. And he really hit home with me in terms of children who are traumatized view the world like this. So everybody in the world is a tiger that's going to eat them. So imagine that you come to school and that's the perception you have in your head. So if we saw a tiger, most of us would run, which is what children want to do. So again, remember this picture when you're thinking about how children are seeing the world and what we are creating to either perpetuate their perception that there's a tiger in the room, or what we're doing to eliminate that. So here's just a trauma survivor's account. And this one's really important for educators. This is a little girl who was traumatized. And here's her comment. I remember crying in the night. I found it difficult to hear Mrs. Patterson when she spoke in the classroom. I felt as if she were speaking from beneath tumbling water or from the end of a long tunnel. She assumed I was daydreaming. I stopped imagining that I might one day be a teacher. No longer did my imagination dance me through the leaves. The sound of ringing church bells irritated me. Mostly, I felt ashamed and different. And this is an account from a young adult who grew up as a trauma survivor. And again, she did get yelled at a lot from the teacher because the teacher felt like she wasn't paying attention. And remember that perception of the world. Here's a child losing hope. So the experience of the child, when they come into a situation and they're operating from a trauma brain, the questions are, where is the tiger? Am I safe? Will I be judged? Will I be rejected? And then they go into, maybe I'll just pretend I don't care. Because if I don't care, nobody will worry about it. Or I'll fail because then I'm in control. I can choose failing. At least I control my destiny. And again, children from trauma want to control. They want predictability. They want safety. So again, these are the things that we're going to have to give them. So what's a trauma-informed approach? The three key words here: realizing, recognizing, and responding. So we're realizing that widespread impact of trauma and understanding those potential paths for recovery. And again, not every child operates from this, but many do. Many more do operate from a trauma base than do not, as we have to remember. Recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma in our students, in our families, in our staff, in ourselves, in others involved in the system. So sometimes when we're asking adults, parents to come into school because they may have had a traumatic event in school, they are afraid or do not want to come into school because they fear re-experiencing what they experienced as children. So again, that trauma can come generationally. And then responding by fully integrating our knowledge about trauma into everything we do in school, into our policies, into our procedures, into our practices, into our disciplinary actions, into how we interact with each other and our children, and seeking to actively not re-traumatize these children. And we're going to learn some things to do that. So again, our 4 R's, and these are not linear. It's a circle. There's no start and no finish because they interact, they're dynamic. Sometimes we may not recognize something. And then later on, we realize that we didn't recognize it. And so we have to go back. And so it's a constant loop that we're constantly looking at things and realizing what's going on and responding differently or changing our response so that we can not re-traumatize children. So our 6 principles of a trauma-informed approach is really safety, trustworthiness and transparency, and I'm going to talk about each of these individually, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender considerations. So safety is a primary one for people who come from trauma because, again, the world is unsafe to them. So we have to change how that brain for them functions. So in order to change that, we really have to make things safe for them so that they can have a safe experience. So that when an event happens, their sensory transmitter does not go immediately to responding, that they can think about whether they are safe, that they can do things differently. And the way we do that is by some of the things that are listed here. You know, arranging the classroom differently. Maybe if I see a child does not do well with another child because they're loud or they laugh a lot or whatever, I might move their seats and rearrange the tables. We limit distractions. Sufficient staffing, having enough adults in the room to help people, and the routines. The routines is something that is so critical during this COVID time at home and in schools. Children are coming back to school with a new routine. We are at the driver's seat of that routine, and we really need to make sure that children are aware of it and a part of it. So we're going to talk about that too. Having clear directions and preparing students for changes. They've been through a massive amount of changes from last year to this year, and things are still changing. And the other thing is staff have to feel safe too. And, you know, I know there's been a great deal of discussion about staff safety, and that is just as important as children's safety right now. So when we talk about safety, we're talking about physical safety, psychological safety, and emotional safety of everyone involved. And you'll hear me say that a lot, but a trauma-sensitive, informed approach is everyone. It's not just us and them. It's really everybody. Trustworthy and transparency. You know, the goal of all the operations and discussions are conducted with transparency, with the ultimate goal of building and maintaining trust with students, their families, the staff, and others involved in the organization, from the administrator down to the secretary. So that's where we get stakeholder decision making. It's not just one person making decision, it's everybody at the table. Being clear about why decisions are being made. Communicating expectations, and this is a really important one, and I'm going to come back to it a lot because it can prevent a lot of the behavior problems that we see in schools. Display and review schedules, that is all about the routines. You know, children need to know what's happening. They need to have some predictability. That is one of the biggest things with the COVID climate right now, is there's so much uncertainty. So as much as we can give children and educators and people involved in the system a daily schedule and routine and awareness of what's going on, the more important it can be. You know, and staff exploring problems. You know, what are the problems? How can we solve them? Who needs to be at the table to solve these problems? So just an example, I had a school that brought in a mental health agency from outside, and they were supposed to supply mental health counseling to help the counselors that were in the school, and they were contracted, they came in, and then what happened is they decided that there was a very limited criteria on which they would see students, and so that narrowed down the amount of students the counselors could refer to them. And then once they had that group of students, they began to see those students, but then they wouldn't communicate with the counselors because they said there, you know, was confidentiality, but the counselors were part of that confidentiality circle. And so the counselors felt very left out of the loop by these mental health counselors that were contracted in. And again, not sure how that got created, but it does create a situation where people don't trust each other. And then that is not healthy for the entire system. So again, when we talk about trustworthy and transparency, it has to be everybody. Again, actively listening, staff actively listening. I can't tell you how often children say to me, nobody listens to me. My teachers don't listen to me. The counselor doesn't listen to me. My mom doesn't listen to me. It's really hard to actively listen. And in my practice, I see a lot of couples, and most of what I'm doing a lot of times is working on communication and having couples listen to each other. Consequence delivery, that needs to be, consequences need to be delivered in a manner that is positive and not negative. It needs to be not punitive. The consequences need to match the behavior. We're going to talk about that a little later. You know, we need to have restorative conversations and strategies. And restorative conversations are not those conversations where, you know, somebody says to a child, well, you're lazy and you're not going to amount to much and you're never going to go anywhere in your life. That is not a restorative conversation. We need to change that up because sometimes that is our frustration and not actually what we are intending to say or the outcome we're intending to have. Peer support, you know. We need to have that peer support not only among the staff, but among the students, you know, and the parents. Support and mutual self-help are key tools to establishing safety and hope. We need to build that trust. We need to enhance the collaboration. Utilize their stories and lived experiences to promote healing and recovery. In the case of a parent who had a horrible school experience and doesn't want to come into the school, I can have a conversation with them. Maybe I meet them after school when nobody is there, or maybe I meet them outside the school on the steps and we have a conversation. And then eventually I can get them into the building where we can do collaborative work with each other. And I do that with, the start of what we did today. I recognize my own trauma. Sometimes our traumas get in the way of what we're doing. I have effective interactions with others. That's really communicating, listening to people, collaborating, that whole trustworthy, being transparent, helping students understand how their behavior affects others. Sometimes they don't know how they're affecting others, but sometimes we don't know how our behavior affects our students. Having positive interactions, discouraging bullying, and then modeling. And you're going to hear me say modeling a lot because children look to the adults around them to see if they are modeling the behaviors that they're talking about. So if we're teaching pillars of character and we're teaching respect, and then we are not respectful to our coworkers, children see that. And then our whole lesson of respect kind of goes out the window. So we really need to understand that we are a model for those children in our school every day. Collaboration and mutuality. This is a place, where we put importance on partnering and leveling the power differences between staff and students. And when I say that, I don't mean to say that staff are not going to be in charge and students are going to be running the show, but it's a different approach. It's a collaborative approach. It's everybody at the table, everybody having some input from the clerical to the administration. We know now that healing happens in relationships. We know that that is a major part of therapy, is the relationship between the therapist and the client. We know that in connections with other people, we heal. There's healing in communities. Healing happens in meaningful sharing of power and decision making. And everyone has a role in the trauma approach. It's no longer we send the child to the principal. It's no longer we send the child to the counselor. We all have to be in it together. And so we really have to look at what are these students' strengths and interests. There was a student who was in a school, an urban school, and did not do well in academics, had a really hard time, severe trauma in his childhood, but really was good at baseball. But because of the school's rules that you had to see average or better, he could not participate on the baseball team. And again, this is not saying we do away with the rules. We don't lower our expectations for children who have been traumatized. We keep our expectations because we want them to rise to the expectation. So what they did is they allowed him to practice with the team 1 or 2 days a week, with the ultimate goal of you can be on the team if you can also do your academics, and we're going to help you with your academics. They don't have to be great. They don't have to be straight A's, but you do have to do things like all your homework. And as he did the things that he was required to academically, his ability to participate in the baseball team grew and grew and grew until there came a point where he had managed to get the grades he needed to be on the team. And what a great shift in his perception of the world. So again, we need to recognize those participation opportunities, and we need to be flexible in our consequences and how we manage behavior. And more importantly than anything is staff self-care. We need to be taking care of ourselves. And I know at the beginning of this COVID climate, there was a whole lot going out about staff self-care and wellness. And teachers were saying, if I hear one more person talk about yoga, I'm going to scream. But we now know that is so important for trauma healing, for us to be back in our bodies and be aware of our bodies and be in touch with our bodies and connected with our bodies. Empowerment, voice, and choice. This is really important. So we provide multiple ways for children to learn. Some children learn experientially, some children learn auditory, some learn visually. I'm an experiential learner. I love to do things. If you talk at me for a long time, you might lose me. We need to see that in our students and find out what works best for them. We need to develop those skills that we see maybe a little weak, but we also need to really accentuate the skills that they really do have. And this will enhance their positive self-identity. Children from DAMA really think that they're bad, that they can't, that there's no good about them. Remember that good-bad dichotomy. There's one or the other, and mostly it's bad. So again, we need to lift children up. We need to give children choices. And that's not that they take over and they can do whatever they want. I give them two choices. Often I tell adults and parents, give them two choices you can live with, but let them choose between them. You know, this is, you know, a way a child learns to be self-confident, and they learn to make decisions, and they learn to make choices that are good. Again, students' strengths, shared decision-making. Okay, class, you know, we have to do this, this, and this. We have to do A, B, and C. So do we want to do A now and B and C after recess? Do we want to do A, B first and C after recess? Do we want to get them all over with and have maybe 5 minutes more for recess? How do we want to do that? You know, and again, things that I can live with, but I do that. Shared goal setting. When I worked in the inpatient unit, we started every day with a morning meeting and a goal. And it doesn't have to be a big goal. It can be, you know, for schools, it can be, I'm going to knock it out of my seat more than 3 times, or I'm going to raise my hand, you know. And at the end of the day, we had a meeting just to regroup and say, how'd that goal go? Not did you meet it? How did it go? Because if we didn't meet it, we don't want them to have a sense of failure. We want to let them know that they can try again tomorrow. And what can we do differently tomorrow to maybe help you? So again, shared goal setting. Cultural humility. You know, I know, you know, most schools, you know, not everybody's in charge of hiring, but it is helpful when the racial ethnic makeup of the school matches that of the staff. When it doesn't, we need to do some extra things. We need to have some people, exemplars from those racial and ethnic makeups that are in our schools that we acknowledge and raise up so that they can see there is a person like me. And then our teaching and our instruction contains those same exemplars. People that are of the same color, people who are of the same race, people of the same ethnic background, who have done wonderful things and survived their own traumatic events and done great things in the world. Children need to see that. Culturally sensitive learning activities. You know, sometimes we have a show and tell, and we have everybody bring something in from their race and culture, and we teach each other different things. Student engaging in activities, you know, that are culturally sensitive. You know, organizations actively moving past cultural stereotypes and biases based on religion, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, age, gender, identity, geography, you know, so that our children do feel safe. So, you know, in one of the schools I was in, they made transgender bathrooms. That was a great thing for those transgender youth who attended school there. However, they didn't change some of the ideas of some of the staff who worked there. So those children still encountered some negative comments from teachers about those bathrooms and about transgender people. And that was very hurtful for them. So although they put a good thing in place, you know, it was challenged by these other things that were happening to the children. So again, you know, we have this ARC model, which is all about, again, building secure attachments. So A for attachments between children and caregivers, enhancing self-regulatory capacities, which is the R, teaching children to handle their emotions and us handling our emotions and modeling the same, and increasing competency across the multiple domains. So this is kind of the model we really want to keep in our mind when we're doing things in our classroom. And, you know, ARC is a core component. It's just a framework designed to support both the organizational change, individual, the family, you know, our didactic interventions with youth. It's really organized around those core domains of attachment, regulation, and competency. You know, attachment, building those safe caregiving systems. You know, regulation, supporting youth to regulate across the multiple domains that we ask them to operate in. And then supporting factors that are associated with resiliency. So we're going to look at traditional approaches versus trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive approaches. You know, traditionally, the question we always ask is, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you doing these things? You know, trauma-sensitive, what happened to you? What's going on with you? Tell me your story. You know, avoiding negative labels. A lot of children who have 504s or IEPs will often say that people look at them as their label. They don't see them, you know. They only see ADHD, or they see on the spectrum, or they see they have a behavior problem. You know, instead of really looking again underneath that label and finding out what's going on underneath that. And we call that informed understanding. You know, I have a conversation with the child. Traditional is purposeful behaviors. Children are doing things to us. You know, that is a common in our, you know, non-traditional systems where children are sort of looked at and said, oh, well, they're doing that purposely. You know, they're not doing their homework purposely, or they're calling out in class purposely, or they're just trying to get on my nerves. Versus looking at that as maybe that's an automatic response they're having. Maybe that's something else is going on. Maybe whatever that stimulus was that activated their sensory transmitter that automatically went to a response. Maybe I have to look at that a little bit more closely. You know, the child who, again, don't touch me. That's an automatic response. I didn't do anything wrong, but if I had gone up and maybe not put my hands on a child, even in an intention of just, you know, being nice, and just said, what's going on? What's happening today that you can't do your work? You know, traditionally we've focused on the child. The child is doing something wrong. The child is the problem, the child's behavior. Instead of looking at the bigger picture, what's going on in the environment? What can we change in the environment to support the child? You know, and again, it's not turning your classrooms upside down. It's doing something different. You know, traditionally, it's an authoritative approach where it's my way or the highway. These are the rules. There is no deviation. Trauma sensitive is there is choice and control. That empowerment, voice and choice that we just talked about, you know, giving children a sense of stakeholding. You know, children very rarely have a sense of stakeholding. Punitive discipline. You know, punitive discipline is, you know, you yelled out in class for the third time and I'm really angry and now you go to the principal. Whereas positive strength-based approach, you know, Johnny, I see you really want to answer questions and you really want to be noticed and you really have a lot to say. How can we do that so everybody can hear you, but we can also hear everybody else? And I developed something new. We're going to talk about that a little later. You know, traditionally, I leave it to the counselor. Child has a problem, leave it to the counselor. Trauma sensitive is it's a shared responsibility. Everybody is involved. Children sometimes will talk to a cafeteria worker or they will talk to a custodian, and that's who may have a responsibility to help that child. Again, everybody's involved. So here's some interventions, getting down to nuts and bolts. How can we make our classrooms more trauma sensitive? Definitely have routines. Routines are very important. It's one of the things during this COVID climate we're telling parents all the time. Children need routines. Their life has been disrupted. School, no matter if a child likes it or doesn't like it, is a routine. They get up, they have breakfast, they get on the bus, they go to school, they're at school for X number of periods. This is what happens during school, and then I go home. It is a routine. Without that big part of their lives, their routines have been turned upside down. But we definitely need routines in school. Choices, giving control to our students. How do we want to do our day? You know, again, you know you have to get reading, math, spelling, social studies in. How are we going to do that? You know, present the students with a couple different choices. You know, we have to watch our responses and our reactions. Very important. You know, one of the things you're going to hear me say repeatedly towards the end of this presentation is in response to COVID, we have to be calm. We have to be calm. If we get excited, if we get upset, children will follow our reactions, and they will make it bigger. Don't take things personally. Sometimes what children do have nothing to do with us. Really seeing our students, really looking at them, you know. The child who was sitting in the classroom who said that the teacher thought she was daydreaming, you know. What would have happened if that teacher had had a conversation with that child aside and said, what's happening? I notice you're having trouble focusing on me. What's going through your head? What are you thinking about? You know, again, children may not necessarily tell you the first time out when you ask that question, but they are seeing that you are interested, that you care. And maybe when you ask that the second or third time, they will break down and tell you. Ignoring the labels, you know. Children are people. They might have a diagnosis of ADHD or anxiety, but they are people. They are children with anxiety. They are not anxiety. You know, identifying triggers. What does set off kids? And we're going to be asked to do that in an intervention later. You know, we may not know everybody's triggers. We may not ever know everybody's triggers, but we can certainly pay attention to them. Mentoring programs, aligning a certain number of staff with a certain number of children so that they have that one adult that they can go to, that they know they're going to meet with for lunch every week, or that they know they're going to have an after school group with once a week, you know. And time, really giving children our time. Being sensitive, again, to the cues and triggers, forewarning children, giving them a sense, again, of what is going to happen so there's no surprises. Giving children brain breaks, especially on Zoom. Children are getting burnout on Zoom as well. And sometimes we just need to do a brain break and do something different. Alternative seating, that certainly is when they're back in class. Fidgeting. I know fidgets, when they came out, were not fond of in school, but you know, we have a fidget contract which says if you do X number of things, then you can have your fidget toy for 20 minutes. You know, using visuals. Children love visuals. Building self-regulation skills, you know, and signal plans when things are going to change. Let the children know that. And sometimes, you know, we do some of these things for children who have IEPs or 504s, but it's really doing it for all the children and allowing them to stretch. You know, reduction of assignments. If a child can show me they can do their 2 times table with 3 problems or 4 problems, I don't need them to do 20. Or maybe I let them do some kind of graph or coloring exercise. You know, giving children some extra time. Grounding time. Again, we're learning that with trauma, it is imperative that we learn to get back into our bodies, which are some of the things like breathing and maybe doing some stretching moves. I know when I worked in the schools and I was required to go into a classroom and teach about depression or anxiety or mental health issues, one of the first things I did was have all the students stand up and just stretch. And I would teach them some yoga moves and we would all laugh and be silly for like 10 minutes and then we would get down to work. It allows them to be in their body and we know that that is calming. So specific behaviors in trauma-informed intervention. So I'm just going to go through some of these so you can see how that system works. So a student is not talking. Instead of, you know, keep saying, Johnny, you know, what's wrong, what's wrong, what's wrong, you know, I maybe give them a timeout. Johnny, how about you take a note to the principal? And I write down on the note, Johnny needs to take a walk. He's coming to you. Give him something nice and let him come back. Again, a lot of these behaviors we are going to eliminate from the beginning by our approach to school. So a trauma-informed approach allows us to kind of set our expectations. So when the children come back to school, we talk about all of these things that are here. We give them our expectations and then we maybe brainstorm with children about how can we help you when this is happening. So when children come back to school, I talk about, we're gonna have some rules in our classroom and I wanna make sure everybody can get helped. So when you're not feeling like talking to me, what are some things I can do to help you? And children will come up with some ideas. Might say, well, how about if I write it on a Post-it and I give it to you? Or how about if I stay after class and I talk about it with you for 5 minutes? Or how about if I color for 2 minutes and then I talk to you? And again, I write on my expectations. So when somebody is not feeling like talking in class, here are the 3 things that we can use. And I put that up on the board so that they know. A student yelled at a peer. Again, I start with my expectations. How do we want to handle it in our classroom when children are yelling? When you feel like yelling, how do we want to handle it? What would help you? And I set my expectations. So instead of yelling, we can do A, B, and C. You know, again, sitting outside of the classroom, I set my expectations at the beginning of the classroom. When you're not feeling like coming in because you're afraid or you didn't do your homework or you think I'm going to yell at you or there's a peer who's teasing you or whatever, how can we help you? What are some things that we can do in our class to help each other to do this? You know, again, student is not doing their work. When I get those expectations in the beginning, I can cover all of these things and I can have a tool at my disposal. And children will help you come up with some of these tools. You know, student is not doing their homework. They may be living in an atmosphere where when they go home, they don't have electric or they don't have anybody to help them or they don't know how to do their homework. You know, so again, if I talk about that in the beginning of my class and I say, you know, sometimes I know you guys have trouble doing your homework at home for any number of reasons. Maybe you have to go to church or your mom's too busy to help you or you didn't have any pencils at home or you didn't have the materials. How might we deal with that in school so that we can help you? And one of the students might say, well, maybe if there's a material box that we can dig into to get materials to go home and do our homework, that would help me. Okay, there's an idea and I put that into place. So then again, if I really pack my expectations on the forefront with a lot of tools and solutions for kids, then I'm not dealing with some of these things on the back front. You know, they're doing their homework. They're not, you know, they're not being embarrassed because they don't have the materials or they have to say that. They can just go into my little materials box and get whatever they need and take it home with them. You know, the student yelled at me. We have to model for students what we do when we're yelling or what we do when we're angry. So there was a period of time where classes created Antarctica or quiet spaces in their classroom. But what happened is they became a place of punishment. So while it was a good thing initially, it ended up not being utilized correctly. So one of the things I tell my teachers is when you're going to do a quiet place in the room, model for the children how that works. So maybe when I'm teaching and I'm getting frustrated because my students aren't getting the algebra equation, I say to my students, you know what? I need a few minutes in the quiet space so I can rethink how to teach you this. So you all keep working on your algebra, and I'm going to sit in the quiet space and try to calm myself down so I can teach this differently to you. You know, again, I model for them what I want them to see. So, student breaks something in the classroom. Again, on my expectation side in the very beginning, I model for them what it is I want them to do when they're feeling so angry they want to break something. And maybe in that quiet space, I have some clay or some putty or things like that so that they can be a little destructive within a contained area. You know, again, the student makes a threat. I might deal with that on the expectations on the front. Sometimes, again, if a student is angry or is yelling and I can be calm and I can try to maybe take a whole class and do a breathing moment. I think we all need to do a breathing moment. I don't say Johnny's losing the farm and he needs a breathing moment. I say, let's all do a breathing moment. So again, very different approach through the trauma-sensitive lens than the other one. So we want to create an environment to facilitate success. So I want you to look at this, this grid. So how we intercede with students is directly connected to an effective intervention plan. So, and it's really individual to the student. So for instance, if one child is screaming and I send them to timeout, for one student, That might work because they want attention, and timeout gives them no attention, so it may work. But for another child who's screaming, timeout may actually work as a reinforcer because he or she is trying to escape attention. So therefore, timeout doesn't work and is not functional with all kids. So we need to think about how we set the conditions for whatever behavior we're gonna have. So teachers can generally tell under which condition a behavior occurs. So we set the conditions. We operate under an assumption that the behavior occurred for a reason. So we try to identify that setting and trigger, and we try to predict a specific behavior which continues to occur under these conditions because there's a desired outcome. The child is getting something out of it or getting away from something. So again, we see that setting condition, we see the trigger, we see the problem behavior, and we see the access or the escape. And what we really want to do is do these other different things. In the beginning, we want to teach a replacement behavior. A replacement behavior is a functional, appropriate behavior within the environment for both the teacher and the student. But I teach that before the condition occurs. So good replacement behaviors are usually incompatible with problem behaviors. So if screaming behavior is what is going on to get people to leave the child alone, raising hand will do nothing. But this is how we connect our intervention to the function. So replacement behavior for screaming to get attention is to raise the hand, but I teach that in the beginning where I'm teaching the replacement behavior. Instead of screaming when we want something, we can raise our hand, or we can put our flag up. Sometimes we have flags or desk, or we can write a sticky note. So that when the trigger happens, I can avoid that failure or success route. And again, if I don't have the problem behaviors, I get a replacement behavior that allows the child to still get what they need or avoid what they're trying to do, but then I reinforce how well they did because they did not display the problem behavior. So these behaviors have to be taught, described, modeled, and practiced with the student. And sometimes, like a good exercise is when they're calm, when I'm trying to teach the replacement behavior, is how can we respond? What are the different ways we can respond when we're angry? And one child might say, yell. So I go, okay, so if I yell, then what's going to happen? And the child will say, well, the teacher will yell back at me. Okay, the teacher will yell back at me. And then what happens? Well, then they might call my parent. Okay, then what happens? Well, then I'll get in trouble at home. Okay, let's go back to when I'm feeling like I'm angry. What else can I do? And a child might say, I can tell the teacher. Okay, and what happens if you tell the teacher you're getting mad? They might help me. And how might they help me? They might let me go to the quiet area and play with Play-Doh for a minute until I get my anger out and I can talk about it. And then what would that help you do? That would help me to be able to stay in class and not have my parent called and not get in trouble. So do you see how I'm teaching that replacement behavior before the behavior gets there? So interventions upon return, I was asked to address some things that we can do when children return either remotely or in person or hybrid. So the biggest one is to model calm for the students. We have to model that we are calm, that we are in control of our emotions, that we are able to self-regulate. We need to model that for our students so that they can do the same. So incorporating some of those mindful techniques, incorporating breathing, generating a social service project, giving children to focus on something other than themselves. Again, you see routines, repeating routines over and over because routines are going to be new. Sharing information, and this is a very scary one for me because we don't want everybody sharing all the information and different information. So really important for the staff before children come back to school is decide what is it we're going to talk about. You know, maybe we all decide that in our classrooms we start of school by talking about how is everybody feeling about COVID? How is everybody feeling about remote learning? What are some of the pros? What are some of the cons? You know, what's happened that's good? You know, I do this with my clients in therapy, you know, and some of the responses have been, well, my daddy works from home now, so we get to eat dinner every night with him. Or I see my mommy more because she was traveling for a job and now she doesn't travel. We need to distinguish between virus and other types of sickness we recover from. That's that hopeful piece. you know, yes, there's a virus, but we have recovered from other viruses. These are things that have happened in the past. Here's how we dealt with it. Be honest, and really be honest about how you're feeling. Well, sometimes I'm scared about COVID, or I'm scared my mother might get COVID, or I'm scared that one of you will bring it to school and we won't be able to have school. So being honest, correcting incorrect beliefs. And sometimes children have some really wild ideas about COVID and the virus right now. And if you go to the CDC website, they will have specific ways to talk to each age group about the COVID virus. But we have to dispel some of those beliefs that are incorrect. So one of my younger children, again, their perception was that COVID was actually a monster and it was outside the house door. And so they couldn't go outside the house door because the COVID monster was going to get them. And so again, we had to correct that it was not a monster. It wasn't a physical being that was hiding in the bushes outside the front door. It was a virus, and we needed to explain that in kid terms so that they could understand it. You know, encourage a more active coping style. We're finding all over that movement in our body is so helpful, that being sedentary and sitting is not helpful at all. So again, even when you're on remote, you can encourage children to get up and maybe spin around 3 times and sit down, or do 5 jumping jacks, because we're finding that activity is really a positive coping style. Facilitating a sense of control. For adults as well as children and families, people are feeling that there's no control, there's no predictability. And so I'm being told that we're up for time, but this is my last slide. So provide connections with them for mental health resources and communicate the normalcy of stress. So again, that's my last slide. I'm sorry I went over. But if there's any questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can email me. My information I will put in the chat. And I know I kind of held you over a few minutes, and I apologize for that. Kadi, are there any questions in the chat right now that I can answer, or that I can answer later?
Hi, PJ. So I'm going to keep the Zoom webinar open till about 3:25. I apologize if we went over on time. Of course, you're welcome to email PJ any questions. We want to respect everyone's time. But we do have one question here. There were 2 questions that came up. And the first one was in reference to the pictures of the brain scans.
Mm-hmm.
We had someone ask, are these pictures of the brain from children who are the same age?
Yes, they are.
Okay. Okay,
Yes.
just to clarify. Okay. And then many students are asking when can we go back? And right now we are saying, I don't know. What would you say would be a better response?
Well, if you don't want to say I don't know, which is the honest answer, but you could also say there are multiple people who are working on our return to school. And that includes people who work for infectious disease, people who work for the Center for Disease Control, the superintendents of our school, the boards of education. Everyone is working on how to get us back to our regular routine while putting the best measures in place to keep everyone safe.
Thank you, PJ. As I mentioned before, if there's any other questions that you would like to pose to PJ while we have our webinar open, please feel free to enter them in the chat box. PJ, you touched upon communication with the students and providing that sense of safety. How would you? Here's a question that I have. How would you encourage open and honest communication amongst the children, facilitating or creating that environment amongst each other as a school teacher or as an educator? Let's say in the beginning of a classroom, there's some anxiety surrounding the current situation during this pandemic. How would you facilitate that conversation?
So I think the way I would facilitate that conversation, and I encourage educators, is there needs to be that conversation when you first interact with your class. So if you're going to be on Zoom or if you're going to be remote or in person, you really have to ask children about safety. So I want to make this as safe for you as I can. If I'm on remote, how do we make this as safe as we can so that if you want to contribute to class, that not everybody in your house is hearing you? Or if you want to talk to me separately, how can we do that so that not everybody is seeing that? And really talk to kids and ask them what their parameters are at home, what they need, and how you can help them. Same way in school. If they were to come back in the building, I sit with them. How can we make this classroom as safe as we can for everybody? So what are you feeling unsafe about? And a child might say, well, I don't see any hand sanitizer. And you can say, okay, there's hand sanitizer over there by the sink. You can use it as often as you want during the day. You know, so again, I really have those conversations with everyone, every stakeholder who's involved, you know, and you may have to have it with the families as well. You know, how can we make it safe for your child so that they can learn and that you can do your job and that we can help them as much as we can. So these are in the conversations where we set our expectations about how this is going to go.
Absolutely. So what you're saying is make it collaborative, and also include the input by all parties, including the, you know, the children who are, we would say, the experts of their own experience in this situation and their own feelings, but devoting the time and space to have those conversations just to provide a sense of safety.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. So we are approaching the time, and as I mentioned before, if you could move the slides a little bit to our QR code.
Okay.
So as I mentioned before, these webinars are hosted by the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, and we are funded by SAMHSA. So as part of our funding, we are required to have an evaluation. You can either use a QR code that you see on the screen, or I will email everyone the individual link to our evaluation survey at the conclusion of this webinar. Also, when the Zoom screen, when you close out, the screen or the web page will redirect you to the survey link. We appreciate in advance your completion of the survey. It gives us credit for each participant attendance. And so let's say we have a webinar of only 23 attendees. If only 10 complete our survey, that means we only get credit for 10. So we really highly encourage you to complete our surveys. We take your feedback very seriously and we welcome it, and it is also anonymous. And with that being said, thank you, PJ, and thank you all for attending. We hope you continue to stay safe and well. And if you have any questions, PJ's information is in the chat box right now. She included that. And then, you can also contact me. I will have my information on the follow-up email sent after this webinar. PJ,
Thank
any
you,
last
everyone.
words? Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Stay safe. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me.
Thank you.